two of Te Koiti Turanga's children. This is from his second, well, it's actually his seventh marriage. But he was a bit of a player, I think, old Te Koiti Turanga. But and he remarried when he was well into his, would have been well into his 60s, 70s, and he married a teenage girl, his cousin, Ripeka Patieri Tūtoko. And she was only a girl of probably only about 15 or so, and they together had another about 10 children, I think. So it was two of those boys, the younger ones that went to that volunteered for the war. That was Pahikori, or Butler Te Koiti, and the youngest son, Tioti Te Koiti. And then there were also the grandchildren, or they were all nephews of Pahikori and Tioti Te Koiti. So there were the four brothers from the Bannister whānau. Their mother was Hera Te Koiti, and there were the three brothers from the Tanahi, Kato Tanahi whānau, and that's my great grandfather. Then there were the Te Koiti brothers, and then there were also two members of the Kini whānau who come from Makaawhio but who volunteered for the war at Wairewa. That was Te Waiponamu Arahura Kini and Honi Kini. At the time there were only 13 able-bodied men in the Pā, and of them 10 volunteered, and 9 served. The 10th that volunteered was a fifth brother of the Bannister whānau, and he was rejected after walking from Makaawhio up to the war office in Hokitika, and the fitness test, but he failed it because he was flat-footed, and then he walked all the way home. My great-grandmother was Anitui Tanahi, and it was her brothers that went to, sorry, it was her brothers that volunteered for the war. There were 3 of them, Akuhata, or August, Tanahi, he went under the name Tanahi. Then the other 2 brothers went under the name of Kato, which was Ngāi in North Island Māori. And so they enlisted as Kato brothers, and that was Kinahi Kiri, or known as Kelly Kato, and Wee Pero Kato, who was known as Wilson. That was the name he enlisted as. And of those two didn't come home, and the third, Akuhata, he came home, was very unwell. He was gassed on the Western Front, mustard gas, and it affected his lungs. And he married. He was unwell, but he married when he came home, and married a cousin of his, Hene Mahuika. And they had 1 child, Albert, and but he died. Akuhata died around about 1923, and he's buried in the Pāpākeri Urupā at Bruce Bay. Yeah, Tawa did. She talked a lot about the uncles, not that she knew them because they had died, and even Akuhata had died by that stage. She may have known him as, oh no, she would have known him as a child, but he just unwell, and they felt it all very keenly for their mother, I guess, because she was left alone. The rest of their siblings had died of another sister had married Hinari Mahuika, and that was Hunia Tanahi. And they had a couple of children, but then she died of cancer as very young, and also their father died while the boys were away at war. They were on their way home, and their father, Kato Tanahi, died. And so it was left to Great Tawa. She was alone, and so that was all passed on to her children, and they all grew up just hearing about the sadness of it, really, more so than the stories, because they never came home to share the stories. They didn't have, well, at that time, they didn't have any welcome home. No, like in town, when the Pākehā diggers, as they're called, came home from the war, they'd often hold a dance, you know, and a celebration. But there wasn't, at that time, there wasn't a marae down there. The old marae had fallen down, and there wasn't even a hall. So there was just basically celebration in the whānau homes. Two of the men who did return home had both been gassed, and that was Akuhata Tanahi and Tioti Tukoiti. They were both quite feeble when they came home, but both married, because they were still young men. I mean, they left for war. They were fighting fit, and they were athletic. They were both great athletes. Tioti Tukoiti was a champion pole vaulter, and he was famous in South Westland, and used to go to all the sports and clean up on the pole vault. And Akuhata was also a well known, and he started to be in the chopping. The champion wood chopper of the empire at the time. He was a Canadian soldier, and he was bragging about, I'll challenge anyone in the empire to beat me, so the Māori boys were up for that. And so there was Pahikori Tukoiti and Dave Huhu Bannister and Jim Bannister, and they were all in the Māori battalion, and gathered at this area at the time. I forget that the field marshal of the troops was there anyway at the time, and so he organised it. And so they had an Anzac, no, it wasn't an Anzac, sorry, it was a whole Empire wood chopping event. And the Canadian fella was beaten into third place, and Jim Bannister was first, and his uncle Pahikori Tukoiti was second, and the world champion was third. At least 4 of them were champion wood choppers, and they picked this up again when they came home. Pahikori Butler Tukoiti, he was invalided home right at the end of the war with a lung disease, but he recovered though, and so he picked up the axe again after a few years, and got back to where he was. And in the 1920s, he was working in the bush up around the Greymouth area, around Lake Brunner, and there was a big chopping event at the Greymouth Town Hall with a champion axeman from Australia, and Butler cleaned up in there as well. So, and he continued that right until his old age. Of the Bannister brothers, Tuhuru Bannister and his brothers William Paitoto Tukoiti Bannister and Jim Bannister were 3 well-known choppers on the circuit, and they all continued that when they returned home, and were famous on the West Coast South Island chopping circuit. And I guess that's why some of them stayed behind. Maka Tukoiti, for instance, he definitely stayed at home, and maybe that was the agreement that they had with these other if they all volunteer, then someone has to stay to look after, because they had a bit of a farm that sustained the whānau, really, and without the men, I mean, who was going to look after it? Couldn't leave it to just to teenagers, I guess. No. And so, it would have been really hard, and being so isolated, they were self-sustaining. Everything that they lived on, that they grew or they caught. So they lived in the old ways. And so 13 out of bodied men in the Pā, and 10 of them had volunteered. Arahura, for instance, they had 2 that went to the war. I don't know why, but there were Tuhuru Tainui and Pisatowhare. Were the only 2 that went from Arahura to the war. I guess it was, which seems a little strange, really, and especially with so many going from the Makaawhio Pā, because you couldn't get anywhere more isolated than Makaawhio Pā. Only 8 years before the war broke, the Makaawhio Pā had been described as the most isolated in New Zealand. David Huhui Bannister. He was only 17, and he volunteered. He must have had the blessing of his parents, who clearly would have known that he was underage, and yet he lied and to put his age up, so he was signed up as an 18-year-old, but in actual fact he celebrated his 18th birthday overseas in the army, and it came back to bite him in the end, because he also volunteered for World War II, where he served as a sergeant, but he didn't actually serve overseas. He was in the army in New Zealand for the Second World War, but in later years, when he retired and he went to collect the pension, of course the war record was he was a year out, so caught up with him in the end. So he had to, yes, he did a bit of scrambling around and had to belatedly fix that up to convince them that in actual fact he'd lied about his age at the time. I'm sure he wasn't the first to do that, but it did catch up with him. They were mostly in the Māori battalion, although 1 or 2 of them were in the infantry. Yes, and I'm not sure why, really, but I guess it depends on the time when they enlisted. But Tuhuru Bannister had been working for some firm over there, or might have been on a farm, I'm not sure, when war broke, and so that's why he enlisted over there. Now, years later, there was a lovely story of an old kaumātua from Arowhenua who had a piece of altea in his possession, and when Helen Wilson, or Helen Rasmussen as she is now, was at Te Waiponamu College, she was at Te Waiponamu College with this fella's daughter, and so she knew the story of this this kaumātua from Temuka, or Arowhenua, who had served in World War I, and he had an altea taonga with him. It just seemed rather strange, but I imagine that's where that was the explanation, was that Tuhuru Bannister gave it to him when he was in Arowhenua, and he took it to the war with him anyway, the altea, and brought it home. I think it's roughly shaped into a heart. Te Oti was buried at Arahura in the Ruataniwha Urapa, and that was around about 1932, 31, 32. Of the Kato brothers, Akuhata, he returned and he married, as I said before, Hini Mahuika, and Hene and Akuhata had one son, and they lived at Bruce Bay. He died down there from the gassing, and he's buried at Papa Kere Urapā at Bruce Bay. His brothers are both buried in London in different urapā over there. And of the Bannisters who came, all of the Bannister Brothers came home, and David is buried in Greymouth. His career led him away from Bruce Bay, and he ended up in Greymouth, died there in the late 1960s. William Bannister, Bill Bannister, he died at Bruce Bay. He continued down there and had a little bit of a farm as well after retiring from the bridge building and etc. So he died at Bruce Bay, and he's buried in Hokitika. Tuhuru Bannister moved to Auckland eventually. He initially returned to Makaawhio, but then he left and he ended up in Auckland, where he married, and he stayed there until he was killed in a car accident in the 1960s. And Jim Bannister, who was the Māori All Black, he was involved in sawmilling, and so he moved around the west coast into different sawmills around South Westland and the Hokitika area, and then he went to Fiji in a sawmill, but he died there. He contracted something like malaria or something, and a tropical disease anyway, and he died, and he's buried in Fiji. The impact of the war had a huge impact on that little pā. I mean, if those men had been around, it would have been a completely different story today.